What happens when a man haunted by loss meets the woman who tried to save his dying wife? In the frozen wilderness of 1886 Colorado, two souls scarred by tragedy are about to discover that sometimes the very person you blame for your pain might be the one destined to heal your heart. This is a story of second chances, hidden connections, and the courage to love again when everything seems lost. A tale that will remind you that fate often works in the most unexpected ways. If you enjoy stories of healing hope and love forged in life's hardest moments, hit that like button and subscribe for more heartwarming tales that will touch your soul. Now let me tell you about James Brennan and Catherine Morrison. She was the nurse who couldn't save my wife. Widowed rancher's heart breaks when he meets her again. The stack of unpaid bills felt heavier than the Winchester rifle hanging above James Brennan's fireplace. He spread them across his kitchen table like a losing poker hand. Feed supplier veterinary services banknote. Numbers that spelled out what he'd been trying to ignore for months. The Brennan Ranch was dying a slow, quiet death. Jim pushed back from the table and walked to the window. Snow covered everything as far as he could see, turning his Colorado property into a pristine wasteland. Beautiful and merciless, just like everything else in the territory. His breath fogged the glass as he counted cattle in the distance. Fewer than last month. The disease had taken 12 head before he'd managed to stop it, but the financial damage was already done. At 35, Jim had survived 3 years of war, a bullet through his shoulder at Gettysburg, and the death of his wife Sarah from influenza. He'd rebuilt his ranch from nothing, earned respect from neighbors, created something lasting from Colorado dirt and determination. But numbers didn't care about determination. Debt was debt. He picked up his coat and hat. The southeast boundary needed checking, and riding fence line beat, staring at bills he couldn't pay. Maybe the motion would clear his head, help him figure out what came next. Maybe he'd find a miracle buried somewhere in the frozen ground. The morning air bit at his face as he saddled Thunder, his black gelding. The horse snorted steam, eager to move after 3 days of confinement during the latest blizzard. Jim swung into the saddle and pointed them toward the valley where his property line met the cemetery. The cemetery, he avoided it most days. Too many memories lived there, too many conversations with headstones that never answered back. But the fence line ran right beside it, and a responsible rancher checked his boundaries regularly. Even a failing rancher. Thunder's hooves crunched through snow crust as they descended toward the valley. The cemetery came into view first, a small collection of wooden markers and stone monuments surrounded by a low fence. Then he saw her. A woman in a dark coat knelt beside a fresh grave, a small pine coffin resting in the snow nearby. She held a shovel with hands that shook from cold or exhaustion, or both. The blade rang against frozen earth with the futile sound of metal meeting stone. Jim reined in, Thunder squinting against the glare of sun on snow. Even from a quarter-mile away, he could see the hopelessness of what she was attempting. The ground had been frozen solid for 6 weeks. Nothing short of dynamite would break it now. He urged Thunder forward, recognition dawning as he drew closer. Catherine Morrison, the widow who'd settled the old Henderson claim last autumn. He'd seen her in town once or twice, always alone, always with that particular kind of determination that came from having no choice but to be strong. She didn't hear him approach. The wind carried sound away across the empty prairie. Jim dismounted slowly, leading Thunder the last 30 yards. That's when he saw the small coffin. Clearly saw the way her shoulders shook with each futile swing of the shovel. His chest tightened. He'd been to enough military funerals to recognize the particular grief of burying someone too young. But this, a mother trying to bury her child alone in January snow, this was different. "Ma'am," Jim said quietly. She spun around, shovel raised like a weapon. Her face was gray with exhaustion and cold, dark circles shadowing eyes that had been crying, but now held only fierce determination. She was younger than he'd realized, maybe 28, with dark hair escaping from beneath her wool hat. "I don't need help," she said. Her voice was breaking, but the words came out strong. Jim looked at the tiny coffin, at the impossible earth, at her trembling hands. Without asking permission, he stepped forward and gently took the shovel from her grip. "Let me," he said. She didn't fight. Her hands fell to her sides as Jim positioned himself and drove the shovel down with all his strength. The ground resisted, then gave slightly. He worked the blade, loosening a chunk of frozen dirt. It was going to take hours, but he set his jaw and kept digging. The woman, Catherine, sank to her knees beside the coffin, one hand resting on its rough pine surface. She didn't speak. Jim didn't ask questions. The only sounds were his shovel striking earth, his breathing growing heavier with effort, and the wind moving through the bare branches of a cottonwood tree at the cemetery's edge. An hour passed. Jim's shoulders burned, sweat froze on his neck despite the cold. He'd cleared maybe 18 inches of depth when the sound of approaching horses made him look up. Miguel Santos and Tom McKenna, his two most trusted hands, rode into the cemetery. They took in the scene with one glance. Jim digging the woman kneeling in the small coffin waiting. Miguel dismounted without a word, walked to his saddle and pulled out a pickaxe he'd brought for fence work. Tom joined him. Together they began working alongside Jim, taking turns with shovel and pick. Three men digging a grave for a child they'd never known. One woman keeping vigil beside a daughter she'd never see grow up. The hole deepened slowly. 2 feet, 3 feet, deep enough. Miguel stepped back first, removing his hat. Tom and Jim did the same. The grave was ready. Catherine stood on legs that trembled. She bent and lifted the small coffin. It was so light, that was the cruelty of it. Her daughter had weighed almost nothing even alive. In death, she was lighter still. Jim moved to help, but Catherine shook her head. She needed to do this part herself. She knelt at the grave's edge and lowered the coffin with shaking arms. The pine box settled on frozen earth with a soft sound that seemed too quiet for something so final. Catherine stayed kneeling, staring down. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Jim had seen grief before. He'd lost men under his command during the war. He'd watched Sarah die slowly, fever taking her degree by degree. But this was different. Raw, immediate. He reached into his coat and pulled out the worn Bible he always carried. His hands were stiff with cold as he opened to the passage he wanted. "Ma'am," he said gently, "if you'd permit me." Catherine looked up at him with empty eyes. She nodded once. Jim's voice was steady as he read. "He shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs with his arm and carry them in his bosom." The words from Isaiah felt inadequate, but they were all he had. He continued reading verses about children in heaven, about God's tender mercies and comfort for those who mourn. Miguel and Tom stood with heads bowed. Catherine's shoulders began to shake. Then the sobs came, wrenching sounds that seemed torn from somewhere deep. Jim kept reading. "The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such as be of a contrite spirit." When he finished, he closed the Bible carefully. The silence that followed felt sacred somehow. Jim nodded to his men. Together they began filling the grave, working gently, respectfully. Miguel found 2 sturdy pine branches and lashed them together with leather cord from his saddle, forming a simple cross. The mound of earth grew. Jim patted it smooth with the back of the shovel. Miguel placed the cross at its head, driving it deep enough to withstand the wind. "She'll need a proper stone come spring," Tom said quietly. "I can carve one," Jim replied. Catherine hadn't moved. She stood beside the grave, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the fresh-turned earth. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon. Temperature would plummet once darkness fell. Jim glanced at his men. They understood. "We'll head back to the ranch," Miguel said. He touched his hat brim toward Catherine. "Ma'am, you have our sympathies." Tom nodded his agreement. They mounted and rode off, leaving Jim alone with the widow. "Where's your place?" Jim asked. 2 miles east," Catherine said. Her voice sounded distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "I'll follow you home. Make sure you get there safe." She turned to look at him. For a moment he thought she'd refuse. Then she just nodded and walked to her horse tied to the cemetery fence. She mounted stiffly, moving like someone much older than her years. Jim swung onto Thunder and followed as she rode out of the cemetery. He kept his distance, not crowding her. The sun set behind them, painting the snow orange and pink. Catherine rode with her back straight, but Jim could see her shoulders shake with silent sobs. Her cabin came into view, a small structure tucked against a hillside for wind protection. Smoke rose from the chimney. She must have left a fire burning before coming to the cemetery. Catherine dismounted and went inside without looking back. A moment later, lamplight appeared in the window. Jim waited until he was certain she was safe, then turned Thunder toward home. The ride back gave him time to think. About the woman's grief so fresh and raw, it seemed to fill the air around her, about the way she tried to dig that grave alone, too proud or too isolated to ask for help, about the weight of a small coffin, and the particular silence that followed a child's funeral. He thought about Sarah, 3 years gone now, from influenza. How he'd felt helpless, watching her fade, how the doctor had done everything possible, but it wasn't enough. How grief had a way of making the whole world feel empty. By the time he reached his ranch, darkness had fallen completely. The main house sat dark except for the kitchen lamp he'd left burning. Inside, those bills still waited on the table, but somehow they seemed less important now. Perspective, he supposed. A man worrying about money was still a lucky man compared to a woman burying her only child. Jim stabled Thunder, fed the other horses, checked on the cattle one more time. Normal evening routines, but they felt different somehow. The encounter at the cemetery had stirred something in him. Not just sympathy, but recognition. He understood loss, understood the particular weight of being alone with grief. Maybe that's why he found himself planning to return tomorrow, to check on her, make sure she was managing. It was the neighborly thing to do, the Christian thing. It had nothing to do with the way her eyes had looked when she'd thanked him, or the strength he'd seen in her shoulders as she'd lowered that coffin herself. Nothing at all. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Jim loaded his wagon with split firewood and supplies from his ranch stores. He told himself he was just being practical. A woman alone would need wood, would appreciate coffee and flour. He didn't examine too closely why he'd chosen his best supplies or why he'd spent extra time grooming Thunder. Catherine's cabin looked smaller in daylight, more isolated. Smoke rose thin and straight from her chimney. Her barn door hung crooked on broken hinges. Her small herd of cattle clustered near the water trough, looking thin. Jim knocked on her door and waited. When it opened, Catherine stood there in a simple dress, her dark hair pulled back severely. She looked like she hadn't slept. "Morning," Jim said, touching his hat brim. "Brought firewood. Thought you might be running low." "I have enough," Catherine said. It was automatic, the response of someone who'd learned to refuse help. "Then you'll have more," Jim replied. He began unloading without waiting for permission. Catherine watched for a moment, then moved to help. They worked in silence, stacking wood against the cabin wall. When the wagon was empty, Jim walked toward her barn. "Your door's hanging crooked," he observed. "Hinge broke. I've been meaning to fix it." "I'll do it now if you've got spare hardware." She showed him where her husband's tools were kept. Jim worked efficiently, removing the broken hinge and replacing it with one from the collection. The door swung smoothly when he finished. "Thank you," Catherine said. The words seemed to cost her something. "Coffee if you have it," Jim asked. She nodded and led him inside. Catherine's cabin was clean but sparse. A small table, 2 chairs, a bed in one corner. A child's cradle sat empty beside the bed, and Jim felt his chest tighten at the sight of it. Books were stacked on a shelf, more books than he'd expected. A piano sat against one wall, sheet music scattered on top. She poured coffee from the pot on the stove. They sat at her table, steam rising from their cups. "Your cattle look thin," Jim said carefully. "You got enough hay to get them through? I could bring some extra. No charge. I've got surplus this year." Catherine wanted to refuse. He could see it in her face, the instinctive pride that came from learning to survive alone. But pride wouldn't feed cattle. "That's generous," she said instead. They drank coffee in silence. It wasn't uncomfortable. Jim seemed content to sit quietly, and Catherine found she didn't mind the company. There was something steady about him, something that didn't demand conversation or explanations. "The baby," Jim said finally. "What was her name?" "Emma." Catherine's voice caught slightly. "That's a pretty name." More silence. Then Jim spoke again, his voice careful. "I lost someone too. My wife, Sarah. Influenza took her 3 years ago." Catherine looked up at him, really looked for the first time. She saw grief in his eyes, old and settled, but still present. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Long time ago now, but you don't forget." Jim finished his coffee and stood. "I'll be back in a few days, check on things." "You don't have to." "I know," he said, "but I will." After he left, Catherine stood at her window, watching his wagon disappear over the ridge. For the first time since Emma died, she didn't feel completely alone. 3 days later, Jim returned with hay. He helped her distribute it to her small herd, showed her how to check the cattle for signs of illness. The week after that, he brought lamp oil and coffee. The week after that, he repaired a section of fence damaged by wind. A pattern emerged. Every few days, Jim would arrive with some practical purpose. Fence to mend wood to split supplies to deliver. He never came empty-handed, never stayed too long. They'd share coffee, exchange a few words, fall into comfortable silence. Catherine found herself watching for him on the days he didn't come. The cabin felt emptier on the days he did. Something in her chest loosened slightly. One afternoon in late January, Jim noticed the piano. "You play?" he asked. "Used to. Before." "Play something now." Catherine hesitated, then sat at the bench. Her fingers were stiff at first, but memory guided them. She played a simple melody, "Beautiful Dreamer," something that wouldn't remind her too much of Emma. When she finished, Jim was smiling slightly. "That was fine," he said. "Real fine. Do you know Lorena?" She did. Catherine played the sad, sweet ballad while Jim listened, his coffee growing cold in his cup. When the last notes faded, he was quiet for a long moment. "My wife used to play that song," he said. "Different piano, but the same song." "What was she like?" Catherine asked softly. "Sarah, she was bright, like sunlight on water, always singing and always finding something to laugh about. Even when she was dying, she was more worried about me than herself." Catherine's hands rested on the piano keys. "How did you bear it?" "One day at a time, sometimes 1 hour at a time. And I had work to do. The ranch, the cattle. Work helps." "Does it get easier?" Jim considered the question seriously. "It gets different. You make room for it, learn to carry it. The sharp edges wear smooth after it." They talked until late that evening. About loss, about loneliness, about the particular challenge of rebuilding a life after someone central to it was gone. When Jim finally left, Catherine realized she'd smiled. Just briefly, but it had happened. The ice was beginning to thaw. February arrived with deceptive calm. The sky stayed clear for days and temperatures rose enough that snow began melting in the afternoon sun, freezing again at night into treacherous sheets of ice. Jim's visits had become routine. Catherine expected him every 3 or 4 days. She'd started timing her chores so she'd be near the cabin when he usually arrived. She told herself it was practical. If he was helping with the heavy work, she should be available. But she knew it was more than that. They talked more now. Small revelations carefully offered. Jim told her about his ranch, about the horses he bred for mountain work. Strong stock that could handle Colorado winters and steep terrain. "It's what my father started," he said one afternoon. They were mending harness in her barn hands, working leather while they talked. "He had this idea that you could breed for cold tolerance, sure feet, steady temperament all together." Most folks thought he was crazy. Was he? Oh, little bit. But he was right too. Took 20 years, but we've got horses now that other ranchers come asking for. Catherine found herself telling him about her life before Michael died. How she'd grown up in Missouri, daughter of a doctor. How she'd trained as a nurse during the war, worked in field hospitals from Antietam to Appomattox. "Never read much about Army nurses," Jim admitted. "Most people haven't. We weren't supposed to talk about what we saw." "What did you see?" Catherine was quiet for a moment, leather still in her hands. "Boys dying. Hundreds of them. Some we could help, some we couldn't. You learn to tell the difference pretty quick." Something in her voice made Jim look up. There was a weight there, a particular kind of pain he recognized from his own war memories. "You blame yourself," he said, "for the ones you couldn't save." "Sometimes." Catherine's hand stilled on the harness. "There was this one soldier, bullet through the lung. I knew he wouldn't make it, but he was so young. Kept asking for his mother. I held his hand until he was gone. That's all anyone can ask for. Not to die alone, I suppose." They worked in silence after that, but it was a companionable silence. Catherine realized she'd told him things she hadn't spoken aloud since the war ended. Jim had a way of listening that made words come easier. The next time he visited, Catherine had fresh bread waiting. She'd baked it that morning, telling herself it was just practical. She needed bread anyway. But she'd used the last of her good flour and added honey she'd been saving. "This is fine bread," Jim said. "Best I've had in months. The men at your ranch don't bake. They try, results are mixed." He grinned. "Miguel makes biscuits that could stop bullets. Tom burns everything. Mostly we eat simple." Catherine laughed. It surprised her, the sound of her own laughter. She'd forgotten what it felt like. "I could teach them," she offered, "if you wanted." They'd probably appreciate that. I know I would. The conversation shifted to easier topics, weather cattle the coming spring, but underneath ran a current of something else, something neither of them named but both felt. When Jim left that evening, he paused at his wagon. "Catherine," he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. "I'm glad I rode past that cemetery back in January." "So am I," she said quietly. He nodded and drove away. Catherine stood in her doorway longer than necessary, watching until his wagon disappeared. That night, lying in bed, she let herself think about possibilities, about what it might mean that a good man had started visiting regularly, about whether her heart could risk opening again. Emma's absence still ached, but Jim's presence had become something she looked forward to. The two truths existed together, grief and hope side by side. Maybe that was how healing worked. Not forgetting, but making room for something new alongside what was lost. The blizzard hit on February 15th with a violence that surprised even longtime Colorado residents. Jim saw it coming. A dark wall of clouds building in the northwest, the particular quality of light that meant heavy snow and killing winds. He'd planned to check on Catherine that afternoon anyway. The approaching storm made it urgent. He rode fast, pushing thunder harder than usual. The wind was already picking up temperature, dropping by the minute. By the time he reached Catherine's place, the first flakes were falling thick and fast. She was outside struggling to drive her small herd of cattle toward the barn. The animals were spooked by the wind scattering instead of gathering. Jim dismounted and moved to help without speaking. Together, they worked, moving methodically, pushing the cattle into the barn. Snow was falling thick now, visibility dropping fast. The wind howled across the prairie, driving snow horizontal. They got the last cow inside just as the full force of the storm hit. Jim latched the barn door while Catherine distributed hay. Thunder whinnied nervously in the sudden darkness. "Bring him inside," Catherine shouted over the wind. "There's room." Jim led his horse into the barn, unsaddled him, gave him feed and water. Through the barn walls, the wind screamed. Snow was already piling against the door. "Can't ride home in this," Catherine said. It wasn't a question. "No, I'll wait it out in the barn." "Don't be foolish. Come to the cabin." They ran from barn to cabin, bent against wind that tried to knock them over. Snow stung their faces, got in their eyes and mouths. Catherine's door was only 30 yards from the barn, but they were both gasping when they got inside. Jim secured the door while Catherine built up the fire. The cabin was small, one room with a loft. Jim saw her bed in the corner, Emma's empty cradle beside it. A wave of awareness hit him. They'd be alone together, possibly for days. "I can sleep by the fire," he said. "Won't be the first time." "And there are blankets in the chest," Catherine replied. She was being practical, treating this like any other situation requiring hospitality. But it wasn't any other situation, and they both knew it. The storm raged all day and through the night. Wind shook the cabin's snow, piled against the walls until they couldn't see out the windows. Jim and Catherine moved around each other carefully in the small space, maintaining polite distance. The second day was worse. The storm intensified. They were truly trapped now, surrounded by snow that had drifted higher than the windows. The world had shrunk to this one room. They played cards, read from Catherine's books. Jim whittled while Catherine mended clothes. They talked about safe things, weather ranching books, but the careful distance they'd maintained was becoming harder to keep. Catherine cooked beans and bacon over the fire. They ate at her small table knees, almost touching in the cramped space. Outside, the wind continued its assault. "Tell me about your ranch," Catherine said. "Really tell me, not just the horses." So Jim did. He told her about buying the land with his discharge pay, about the first brutal winter when he almost lost everything, about building the house with his own hands, about Sarah arriving as a bride and making it a home. "She planted flowers," he said, looking into the fire. "Everywhere. Said a place without flowers wasn't fit for living. Every spring, she'd order seeds from back east, things that had no business growing in Colorado. Half of them died, but she kept trying." "Do you still plant them?" "No." Seemed wrong somehow after she was gone. Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Maybe it would honor her memory to keep growing beautiful things." Maybe. That night, the careful distance finally broke. Catherine woke crying, harsh sobs that shook her whole body. Jim lay still by the fire, uncertain, but the sobs continued growing worse. "Catherine," he said quietly. I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Her voice was muffled. Jim stood and moved to her bedside. In the dim firelight, he could see her sitting up, arms wrapped around herself. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me about her." And she did. Everything poured out. Emma's birth, the joy of it, the fear of raising a child alone. How Emma had started smiling at 2 months, how she'd reached for Catherine's hair and grabbed it tight. The sound of her laugh, the weight of her in Catherine's arms. The fever that came so sudden and burned so hot. The desperate ride for the doctor. The terrible moment when Emma's breathing changed. Jim sat on the floor beside her bed and listened. He didn't try to fix it or minimize it. He just listened. When her words ran out, he shared his own grief. Sarah so full of life until influenza took her. How he'd felt helpless, watching her fade, how the army doctor had done everything possible, but it wasn't enough. "Dr. Morrison," Jim said without thinking. That was his name, good man, but there was only so much. Catherine went very still. "Dr. Morrison?" "Yes, why?" "What did your wife look like?" Jim was puzzled by the sudden intensity in her voice. "Sarah, she was small, blonde hair, blue eyes." "Why are you asking?" Catherine's hands had gone to her throat. "What year did she die?" 1883, February. "Catherine, what's wrong?" She was staring at him now, her face pale in the firelight. "What regiment were you with?" "The 2nd Colorado Cavalry." "Catherine, you're scaring me." "Oh God," the words came out as a whisper. "Oh God, Jim." "What is it?" Catherine's voice was shaking when she spoke. "I know who you are. I remember now. You came to the field hospital at Glorieta Pass, bullet through the shoulder." Jim felt the world shift beneath him. "That was you." "I was there when they brought you in." "Sergeant James Brennan, 2nd Colorado. You kept asking about your men, whether they were safe." The memories came flooding back. A field hospital chaos pain. A nurse with dark hair and gentle hands. A voice that had kept him calm while they dug out the bullet. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "And 3 years later, you brought your wife to my father's clinic. Sarah Brennan with influenza that had turned to pneumonia. I was there, Jim. I helped try to save her." The silence stretched between them. Jim was remembering now. The young nurse who'd worked alongside Dr. Morrison. Who'd held Sarah's hand when the fever was worst. Who'd been there at the end. "You were there when she died," he said. "I was. I'm so sorry, Jim. We tried everything, but she was just too weak." "I know. I never blamed the doctor. Never blamed anyone." He paused. "Except maybe myself." "Why yourself?" "For not bringing her in sooner. For thinking it was just a cold. For not being enough to keep her alive." Catherine reached out and took his hand. "You couldn't have known. By the time you brought her to us, the infection was too advanced. Nothing would have changed the outcome." They sat in the darkness, hands clasped, sharing the weight of old grief. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, something was shifting. "Is that why you recognized my voice?" Jim asked. "That first day at the cemetery. I thought there was something familiar, but I couldn't place it. You look different now. Older, harder. The beard changes your face. You look the same. Just sadder." Catherine's laugh was bitter. "War changes you. Losing patience changes you. And now losing Emma. But you kept going. Kept helping people. Until I couldn't anymore. After the war, I couldn't stand the sight of another sick room. That's why I married Michael came west. I thought I could leave all that behind. And now I don't know. Today, sitting here with you talking about Sarah, it doesn't hurt the way it used to. Maybe time really does heal wounds." They talked until dawn, the storm still raging outside. In the darkness and isolation, defenses fell away completely. They were just two people who'd known terrible loss, finding comfort in shared understanding. The third day, the storm began to break. Wind died down, snow stopped falling. They could see sky again, pale and promising. Jim prepared to leave. He saddled Thunder in the barn while Catherine made coffee for the journey. When he came to the cabin for it, the air between them felt charged with something unspoken. "Thank you," Catherine said, "for listening. Thank you for letting me stay." Their eyes met. Jim took a step toward her, then stopped. Whatever was building between them deserved time, deserved to develop naturally. Rushing it would dishonor what they'd shared. "I'll be back when the road's clear," he said. Catherine nodded. Jim rode away without looking back, but he felt her watching from the window. That night alone in his own cabin, Jim admitted the truth to himself. He loved her, not from pity or obligation, but from genuine affection and respect. The question was what to do about it. The answer came sooner than expected. 3 days after the storm, Tom McKenna came riding hard to the main house, his horse lathered with sweat. "Boss, you need to come quick. Miguel's been hurt bad." They found Miguel in the south pasture, trapped under his fallen horse. The gelding had stepped in a hole, gone down hard, pinning Miguel's leg. Tom had managed to free him and get him onto a travois, but the man was unconscious and losing blood. "Get him to the house," Jim ordered. "I'll ride for the doctor." "Doc Harrison's in Denver," Tom said. "Won't be back for a week." Jim's heart sank. Miguel was like a brother to him. They'd fought together in the war, built this ranch together. Without a doctor. Then he remembered. Catherine Morrison. "The widow boss, she ain't no doctor." "She's a trained nurse. Worked Army field hospitals during the war. Tom, ride to her place, bring her back as fast as you can." "What if she won't come?" Tell her Sergeant Brennan needs her help one more time." An hour later, Tom returned with Catherine riding behind him. She'd come immediately bringing a bag of medical supplies. Jim met them at the house. "Where is he?" she asked, all busyness now. They carried Miguel to Jim's bed. Catherine examined him quickly, efficiently. Her hands were steady, her voice calm. "Broken leg, possible internal bleeding, but he's stable. I need clean cloth, hot water, and whiskey for disinfectant." For the next 6 hours, Catherine worked to save Miguel's life. She set his leg with the skill of someone who'd done it hundreds of times. She stitched a deep gash on his thigh, monitored his pulse and breathing, gave him laudanum for the pain when he regained consciousness. Jim watched her work, saw the confidence and competence she'd set aside when she'd left her nursing life behind. This was who she'd been before grief and isolation had worn her down. This was the woman who'd tried to save Sarah, who'd held dying soldiers' hands, who'd given everything she had, healing others. "He'll live," she said finally, washing blood from her hands. "The leg will heal clean if we keep it immobilized, but he'll need watching for the next few days." "Thank you," Jim said. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to. This is what I was trained for." They sat at his kitchen table drinking coffee while Miguel slept. Catherine looked more alive than Jim had seen her since that day at the cemetery. "You miss it?" he said. "The nursing. I thought I'd put it behind me, but today felt right, necessary. Maybe that's what you're supposed to do with the pain. Not hide from it, but use it to help others." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Maybe." She stayed 3 days monitoring Miguel's recovery. During the days, she was all professional competence. But in the evenings, sitting by the fire after Miguel was settled for the night, she and Jim talked. About the war, about the patients she'd lost and saved, about Sarah's final days and how Catherine had tried everything to save her, about forgiveness, forgiving yourself when you couldn't save everyone, forgiving God when life seemed cruel beyond understanding. On the third evening, as Catherine was preparing to return to her cabin, Jim walked her to the door. "Catherine," he said. She turned to face him. "I know it hasn't been long since Emma died. I know you're still grieving. But I need you to know, I love you. Not from pity or obligation. I love your strength, your skill, your dedication to helping others. I love how you don't need rescuing, but you're brave enough to accept help when it's offered." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Jim, I'm not asking you to stop grieving or to rush into anything. I just wanted you to know my heart and to ask if, when you're ready, if you're ever ready, you'd consider becoming my wife." The silence stretched between them. Wind moved through the pine trees beyond the house. Miguel coughed softly from the bedroom. "Why now?" Catherine asked finally. "Because life's uncertain. Because I'd rather tell you the truth and risk losing you than stay quiet and definitely lose you. Because spring's coming, and I want to follow it with you beside me." Catherine was quiet for so long that Jim thought she was going to refuse. Then she looked up at him, tears tracking down her face. "Yes," she said quietly. "When I'm ready, yes." Jim closed the distance between them and took her hands. They were skilled hands, gentle hands, hands that had brought healing to hundreds of people. "There's no rush," he said. "We'll take whatever time you need." "I know," Catherine squeezed his hands. "That's why I said yes." Spring came early that year, arriving in mid-March with sudden warmth that set streams running and turned the prairie green almost overnight. Catherine had spent the months since Miguel's accident thinking, weighing, preparing. She'd visited Emma's grave every few days, talking to her daughter about Jim, about the possibility of loving again. Today felt different. Today felt like a beginning. She found Jim in his barn grooming Thunder. The black gelding whickered a greeting when he saw her. "He remembers me," Catherine said, stroking Thunder's neck. "He should. You saved his owner's life plenty of times now." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Through the open barn doors, they could see green grass pushing up through the last patches of snow. The air smelled of earth and growing things. "I've been thinking about what you said," Catherine began. Jim's hand stilled on the brush. And, and I think I'm ready, or as ready as I'll ever be." Jim set down the brush and turned to face her fully. "You're sure? I'm sure I want to try. Sure I want to build something with you. The rest, we'll figure out as we go. There's something I need to tell you first, about the ranch." Catherine saw the worry in his eyes. "What about it?" "I'm in debt, deep debt. The cattle disease last year, the feed bills, the bank note. It's all catching up. I may have to sell part of the land just to stay afloat." "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Pride mostly, and because I didn't want you to think I was courting you for your property." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "My land isn't worth much." "It's not about worth, it's about honesty. If we're going to do this, if we're going to marry, you need to know what you're getting into. A struggling ranch and a man who's too proud for his own good. That's about the size of it." Catherine smiled. "Jim, I've been poor most of my life. Poor doesn't scare me. Dishonesty does, but you just proved you're not capable of that." Jim reached for her hands. "So we're really doing this. We're really doing this." They set the date for the first Saturday in May. Catherine wanted time to prepare, to ready herself emotionally for such a big step. She also wanted to plan something special. "I'd like to have the ceremony here at the ranch," she said. "But first I want us to visit Emma together. Of course, I want to introduce you properly, to tell her about us." Jim understood. The dead deserved their due, deserved to be honored in the decisions of the living. The next morning they rode to the cemetery together. The valley was transformed by spring. Wildflowers dotted the hillsides, grass grew green and thick. The cottonwood tree at the cemetery's edge was full of new leaves. Emma's grave had settled over the winter. The wooden cross stood straight, weathered but solid. New grass was beginning to grow over the mound. Catherine knelt beside the grave. Jim stood back, giving her space. "Emma, sweetheart," Catherine said softly. "This is Jim, the man I told you about. The one who helped Mama when she couldn't help herself." Her voice caught slightly. "I need to tell you something, sweet girl. I'm going to keep living. Really living, not just surviving. And that means letting myself love someone again." She was quiet for a moment, one hand resting on the grass covering her daughter. "I think you'd have liked him," she whispered. "He's kind and gentle, and he makes me feel less alone." She stood and turned to Jim, tears tracking down her face but smiling. "She approves," Catherine said. "I can feel it." Jim closed the distance between them and took her hands. "I'll try to be worthy of that approval." "You already are." They stood together beside Emma's grave, two people scarred by loss, choosing to risk love anyway. The spring sun warmed their faces. Around them, the world was turning green. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Catherine moved most of her belongings to Jim's ranch, keeping her cabin for storage and memories. Miguel recovered enough to walk with a cane, insisted on organizing the wedding feast. Tom carved a beautiful headstone for Emma's grave, a piece of granite with her name and dates, and below them, "Beloved daughter, forever in our hearts." Catherine threw herself into ranch work with the same competence that she'd shown in nursing. She organized Jim's chaotic record-keeping, helped develop a plan for paying down the debt gradually. She also began treating neighboring ranchers' sick animals, using her medical knowledge to diagnose and treat cattle ailments. "You could charge for this," Jim pointed out after she'd successfully treated a neighbor's prize bull for bloat. I could, and maybe I will once word gets around. Medical skills transfer more than people think. It was Catherine who came up with the solution to their financial problems. Sitting at Jim's kitchen table one evening, going through ledgers and bills, she looked up at him with excitement in her eyes. What if we combine the ranches, not just in marriage but in business? How do you mean? Your land has the best grazing, mine has the most reliable water source. Your horses are sought after, I have medical skills that could save us hundreds in veterinary fees. Together, we'd have enough land to really expand the horse breeding operation. Jim considered this. It could work, but I wouldn't want you to think I married you for your property. Jim Brennan, if you say that one more time, I'm going to knock you down with a fence post. I'm offering a partnership because it makes good business sense. And because I want to build something lasting with you. A partnership, Jim repeated, liking the sound of it. Equal partners, in business and in life. They married on the first Saturday in May when the prairie was fully green and wildflowers dotted the hillsides. It was a small ceremony held in Jim's front yard, with the mountains visible in the distance. A circuit preacher performed the service. Miguel and Tom stood as witnesses along with 3 neighboring families who'd become friends over the years. Catherine wore a dress she'd sewn herself from blue calico. She'd left off mourning black, but the dress was simple, practical. She carried wildflowers she'd picked that morning. Indian paintbrush and columbine, mountain laurel, and wild roses. Jim wore his Sunday best and couldn't stop smiling. The vows were traditional. Love, honor, cherish in sickness, in health, till death do us part. The words felt weighty and true. When the preacher said, I now pronounce you man and wife, Jim kissed his bride. Catherine's hands rested on his shoulders. The small gathering applauded. There was cake afterward. Miguel had attempted baking and produced something edible, if dense. Catherine laughed when she tried it, promised to teach him properly. The neighbors left as evening came on, wishing them well. That night, Catherine stood in Jim's cabin, their cabin now, looking at the home they'd share. It was larger than hers, better built. There was room for her books, her piano. Room for a life. We can bring anything else you want from your place tomorrow, Jim said. Whatever you need to feel at home. I'd like to keep my cabin, Catherine said. If that's all right, maybe use it for guests or for when we need space. It's yours to keep, Jim said gently. I'm not asking you to give up your independence. She smiled at that. I know. It's one of the reasons I married you. The next weeks were an adjustment, learning to share space, learning each other's habits and rhythms. Jim rose before dawn. Catherine liked to read late into the night. He was methodical and patient. She was quick and intuitive. But they complemented each other, filled in each other's gaps. Catherine taught Miguel and Tom to bake proper bread. She organized Jim's records and developed a system for tracking expenses. She brought music into the ranch house. Piano in the evenings, sometimes her voice singing old ballads. Jim gave her space for her grief. Some mornings he'd wake and find her already gone, knowing she'd ridden to the cemetery. He never followed, never asked. When she came back, he'd have coffee waiting. One morning in late May, Catherine suggested they visit Emma's grave together. They rode out in the golden morning light. Spring was in full bloom now. The cemetery was carpeted with wildflowers. Emma's grave had greened over, completely peaceful and settled. Catherine had brought flower seeds, columbine, the same she'd carried at her wedding. She knelt and planted them around the new headstone while Jim mended the cemetery fence nearby. They worked in companionable silence. Meadowlarks sang, wind moved through new grass. The world was alive with growing things. Tom finished the stone, Jim said when they were done. Want to see it? Catherine looked at the granite headstone Tom had carved. Emma Rose Morrison, it read, born May 3rd, 1885, died January 10th, 1886. Beloved daughter. Below that, in smaller letters, she lives on in love. It's beautiful, Catherine whispered. Tom wanted to add something hopeful. Said grief shouldn't be the only thing remembered. Catherine knelt and traced the letters with her finger. She'll always be part of us, she said. Part of our story. Always, Jim agreed. They rode home slowly, savoring the warm afternoon. The cemetery disappeared behind them, but it would always be there, a place to remember, to grieve, to honor what was lost. But ahead lay their ranch, their home, their life together. Ahead lay possibility and hope in the everyday work of building something lasting. That evening, Catherine played piano on the porch while Jim mended tack. The music drifted across the prairie, joyful and haunting both. Life and loss woven together, grief and hope learning to coexist. Jim looked at his wife in the golden light, her eyes closed as she played and felt gratitude wash over him. For the frozen January morning that had brought him to a cemetery. For the courage to stay when staying was hard. For the grace of second chances. Catherine finished playing and opened her eyes, found Jim watching her. "What?" she asked, smiling. "Just thinking how lucky I am." "We both are," she said. She was right. They'd both known terrible loss, but they'd also found something rare. A love forged in the hardest season, tested by grief and doubt, strong enough to last. By autumn, word had spread about Catherine's medical skills. Ranchers from 3 counties away brought sick animals for her to treat. She charged fair prices and reinvested the money in expanding their horse breeding operation. The debt began to shrink. The ranch prospered. More importantly, so did they. On their first anniversary, Jim surprised Catherine with a garden. He'd spent months preparing it in secret, creating raised beds behind the house. When he let her out to see it blindfolded, she gasped. "Sarah's flowers," he said. "All the varieties she used to plant. I thought maybe we could tend them together." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Jim, it's perfect." They planted together that spring day. Columbine and Indian paintbrush, bachelor buttons, and sweet peas. Flowers that had no business growing in Colorado but would bloom anyway with enough care and determination. "They're not replacing anything," Jim said as they worked. "Not Sarah's memory or Emma's. They're just adding beauty to what we have now." "Like love," Catherine said. "It doesn't replace what we've lost. It just makes room for something new alongside it." That evening, they sat on their porch watching the sun set over the prairie. Catherine's hand rested in Jim's wedding rings, catching the last light. Inside, their home lamps were lit against the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Cattle to tend, horses to train, debts to pay, dreams to pursue. But tonight they were home. Two people who'd once been alone had found their way to belonging. Spring had come, and with it the promise that life, however hard, continues. That love, however scarred, endures. That hope, however fragile, is always worth choosing again. In the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song. The sound carried across the grassland, bower and joyful and free. Thank you for joining us on this journey of love, loss, and healing. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of hope and second chances. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing how these stories resonate with you. Until next time, remember that even in our darkest winters, spring always finds a way to return.